Well, the time is just gone 20 minutes past 9 as we head towards the second half of the show. And still to come on the show, we've got more Hajj diaries coming this morning. We've got the Imran Musa, who will be with us with Hajj Diaries 2023. But before that, the entire world is talking about this catastrophic implosion of the submersible, the Titanic submersible disaster that had taken place. Now, the we've learned that the underwater implosion had taken place, and also looking at just how the this disaster had actually taken place. It has taken place right at the depth of where the Titanic rests, and that is. An implosion which, according to experts, is incredibly quick, taking place within just a fraction of a millisecond. And huge monies obviously had been spent when one looked at the five people who were on board. This included the CEO of the tour operator, a British businessman, a renowned French diver, and a Pakistani billionaire and his son. And we've learned that this expedition with Ocean Gate Expeditions cost in the region of around $250,000 just for a matter of a few hours. And also, we've learned about who the Pakistani billionaire is. We're talking about Shahzada Dawood and his son Suleiman Dawood, who was 19 years old. They were from a prominent Pakistani business family. And the key question is trying to understand what had actually taken place, but more importantly, to look at how this impacts on many other issues. Because we've learned about third world migrants from the Greek coast just last week, where we've seen 700 people that were cramped in this boat, in this boat, and many of them had actually died. So there are a lot of issues to unpack, and just to look at what the reality of a real world is like. And we are now joined by analyst Ashraf Patel. Ashraf, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Walaikum salam, Brother Inayat and listeners, and Juma Mubarak to all.
Yes, Juma Mubarak to you as well. And while the world is actually focused and trying to get to grips with some of the realities of this Titanic submersible disaster, it has been catastrophic in more ways than one. But there are many other issues that are actually playing out, Ashraf, apart from just this incident that had taken place now. But before we get to discussing some of the other related issues that we want to talk about, just your thoughts, quick thoughts on this disaster that had taken place.
Yes, Inayat. I mean, being in the media, as you know, it's been a huge story over the last few days. I think it's on par with the shuttle Challenger space aircraft that was destroyed in the late 80s. And the amount of media coverage in a globalized world was quite amazing, where the entire major news networks focused precisely on the story of five people, relatively wealthy people, that actually were on a tourist adventure by a startup corporation, Ocean Gate. And it talks to a range of issues. So, just offhand, it is not ironic that the expedition was basically exploring the Titanic ship that sank 110 years ago. And in that very tragic story, of course, all the issues, challenges, the class and spatial issues, the inequalities, the 3,000 that died on the Titanic, there were a range of challenges as well as class and other kinds of issues at that time. And a century later, we see the very same kind of divisions that is quite prevalent in the world today, i.e., on the one hand, very well to do elites that are into adventure tourism. And just last week, as you correctly pointed out, the contrast with the migrant ship of the Greek coast that killed 650 immigrants, mainly from countries like Syria, Pakistan, Lebanon, etc. So it's a huge story, It's a story of inequalities, it's a story of migration, it's a story of technology, and they all come into play in this very unequal, fractured, globalized world.
Well, Ashraf, you speak about technology, and at the same time, we talk about innovation, because I think what is extremely important is to look at comparing this incident with a number of issues. For example, looking at the current shift in geo-economic power of the decline of the U.S. And innovation in particular, and looking at China, because evidence to this effect is China's mission to Mars.
Well, very interesting dynamics. As you know, for instance, President Modi is visiting the US this week, and that is also a big news story. And ironically, one of the discussions in that was more kind of technology and US military support, let's say to India, for instance, to counter China. And yet, ironically, this incident of the Ocean Gate Titanic submersible actually exposed lots of shortcomings in the US system, particularly its innovation system, its compliance and regulatory system, its health and safety records, as well as the inability of its marine or its coast guard, which is known to be one of the best, of not being able to pick up the submersible, the very weak and shabby search and rescue over 4 days. I think all of this shows a glaring gap and weakness of the US system at multiple levels. And if we were to unpack, the first is regulation. For years and years, the US has had what is called, promoted since the Reagan era, deregulation. And they actively sought to defund regulators, especially regarding health and safety. The second is the kind of startup capitalist model where entrepreneurs in the US are praised and celebrated for innovating anything, even useless things, as long as it can make money. And in this context, we have seen the growth of what is called billionaire adventure tourism. And a lot of startups have moved in that space. And the Ocean Gate entrepreneurs moved into the space very quickly because there was money to be made. But they haven't followed the correct safety and regulatory and design and patent processes. And this also speaks to another issue where the markets and the profit motive of the US system actually trumps or actually overrides the broader societal issues. And I think a lot of the analysts and academics, as we speak, have begun a very urgent debate on whether the US innovation system is up to scratch. And you rightly pointed out, with the rise of China, for instance, we've just seen in the last year, for instance, China has managed to send a mission to Mars. And no other nation has done that. The US has done that, but China is the first nation, China and Russia, but China in particular is the first nation to have sent a mission to the dark side of the Mars on the other end. And it shows you that their system of innovation is directed towards a more kind of exploratory, useful innovation to serve humanity. And I think in this context, what we're beginning to see is this case at a geopolitical level signifies a kind of glaring weakness of the US regulatory model, the US innovation system, the lack of coordination amongst different players, etc., etc. There's a lot of reporting over the days that you'll see as they investigate this case. They will find, and they're already finding, lots of gaps in the compliance areas.
Well, definitely there are a lot of gaps, and I think as you also looking at it, comparing it to money, and this is all about money being made, irrespective of what cost. And yeah, we've had it at the cost of five lives that have been lost, but also looking at it purely from a hypocritical perspective, because this is where the hypocrisy actually creeps in. You speak about things like avoiding compliance, not thinking through, looking at all the risks that are associated with the gaps that you speak about in terms of compliance, but also just looking at it purely from a world perspective, because the world has been so engrossed by mainstream media reporting on this particular incident and this disaster. But again, you speak about the lack of coverage, the weak coverage, for want of a better term, with regard to the third world migrants. So this is this unequal world that we are living in, where one looks at this story making massive, massive news right across the world. And on a day-to-day basis, we've seen the Greek, the ship on the Greek coast is just one incident. We've seen it in the past. We've seen the Rohingya at peril at the sea as well, escaping oppression, escaping brutality. And this is exactly what this world is all about, Ashraf.
Definitely, Nayat. As you can see, you rightly, correctly pointed out, for 5 days, the world has become familiar with the five people, these very elite group of people. We even know their names. I mean, how the media has covered the story is that they even personalize this into a sense that the CEO, Ras Stockton, Shehzad Dawood, Hamish, etc. These are the people that took the debut trip to on the Titanic submersible. But the 650 migrants that have passed away last week off the Greek coast are all invisibles. So they are at the bottom rung of, of society. They amongst the poorest of the poor. They are exploited by a range of intermediaries in the global migration system, where you get very poor people from villages in these countries in South Asia and Middle East that would pay 5,000 euros just to get a trip on a very shabby boat to go into Europe. And for the Greek government and authorities refused to allow the ship into EU territory, and hence 650 perished in one day. So this talks to inequalities in the global system, the lack of regulation, but also the kind of resources that are allocated for the public good. So there's billions that can be spent on adventure tourism, such as the Ocean Gate case. But on the other hand, why is there no socially useful innovation that can take place in the third world, in the developing world? If we get resources that go into innovation, technology for, let's say, agriculture or job creation in these poorest of the poor countries in South Asia and the Middle East, you won't get that rush of immigrants going global. And I think this speaks to a deeply unequal world. Um, the rich are getting richer. During the COVID crisis, the billionaire class increased by 500%. And those that are most vulnerable, at least 100 million people, have gone further into poverty because of the COVID crisis. So the inequalities are getting worse in a period of climate change. And I think this throws up bigger issues, whether the US system, pure capitalism, is not serving, it's not even serving the US population, where inequalities are at an all time high, where a few startup billionaires are making big money. And even when they promise products that can achieve certain tasks, those products or services are not up to scratch. And so a lot of money gets wasted in the innovation system, where new kinds of innovation is needed for development, to fight climate change, for agriculture and water technologies, etc. So I think we're at a tipping point where new models are required in a global world.
Well, definitely. And again, Ashraf, when one looks at the lessons to be learned from here, and like you mentioned, is this world, there's a total imbalance as far as this world is concerned, with the inequality that actually exists. And we see this right across the board. Where you cited the example of the COVID billionaires, but also in many other instances, when one just looks at the world of sport alone, in the name of entertainment, the billions that have actually gone through. We've been through the World Cup, and we know what that has actually basically cost a country like Qatar for hosting the World Cup, and all of this in the name of entertainment, but aimed at a specific class, the billionaire class, the millionaire class, and people with money. And there is absolutely no balance that one can actually strike between these commercial interests and looking at just people, and I think you call it societal or fostering societal innovation.
Definitely, Nayat. Just last week, the International Labour Organization (ILO) had the Global Summit on Decent Work, and in their reports, which I've gone through, they have estimated that globally there's over 120 million child laborers. Now you can imagine there's a world system out there, particularly in South Asia and the Middle East and Africa, where 120 million children are employed in labor that earns less than $1 a day. And whereas these children are meant to be in school in order to develop their societies and communities. So this shows you that there is no very little social safety nets, and the current model of globalized or neoliberal capitalism that has been prominent during the COVID years. In fact, Professor Noam Chomsky termed it disaster capitalism, meaning that during disasters, the capitalists move in to profit instead of helping at a humanitarian level. So this is the kind of level of lack of no public values, no interest of the public good, and no humanity, but just seeing every area as a market. And I think this is what is causing deeper inequalities, and it will lead to more social conflicts that we're beginning to see in the world. Africa has over 10 different kind of civil wars at any given time. There's 101 challenges out there, and I think this case, with the media focusing singularly on one case of 5 people over 5 days, has just demonstrated the priority of mainstream media and the importance of community media and critical thinking in a world that has just gone off the radar for most of the 2 billion people that live on less than $1 a day. They would never ever get to the ocean, or if they do get to the ocean, it would be to be trafficked somewhere into Europe, or taking a risky journey to find jobs in Europe or the US. They would never
Yes,
get
Ashraf.
any kind of adventure, yes.
Yes, and it's not only about the media focus; it's about the resources that have now that have gone in and will still go. The amount of resources in terms of money, in terms of human capital, just to investigate what had actually happened. Ashraf.
Definitely. The amount of resources that goes into startups that promise the world. I mean, you just looked at the case of Uber, for instance. The entrepreneurs, they raised billions and billions from investors and IPOs, but yet these kind of models disrupt industry. So, although, for instance, there's a lot of critical articles on the Uber model or Airbnb model, for instance, it's about venture capital that invests in entrepreneurs, but at the end of the day, they disrupt industries. So, therefore, in the Europe, EU, in Germany, France, they are regulating the likes of Uber, where Uber needs to pay taxes, it needs to pay fees to maintain the infrastructure, and it cannot have a free ride as such on the infrastructure of many nations. So this is called the new extractive capitalism that only goes into certain areas of innovation, but it doesn't look at the social whole. So we need a new model of social entrepreneurs that can invest in socially useful technologies And so, for instance, with Ocean Gate, if you were to apply what Professor Mazzucato calls public value innovation, yes, the submersible is a useful technology, but instead of using it for billionaire tourism, they could have gone under the ocean, collected data on ocean currents, on species in the ocean, on managing climate change. And so that paradigm shift would have meant that they would then perform a socially useful function instead of making it something that is consumerist. So I think there's new models that we could look at, and it also shows the gap in the U.S. innovation system, which is falling way behind emerging powers. And we see China leading, we see other nations like Korea leading on technologies in almost every industry. So, for instance, China just recently developed its own Airbus that's competing with Boeing and Airbus. And it shows you a nation, a developing nation like China, has got the capacity and capability to match any kind of technology in the West, but it needs a disciplined leadership and a leadership committed to the development of people and South-South cooperation. So, in that context, I see a better models emerging from the BRICS nations and China and others to go forward in helping nations like Africa and the Middle East so that we can take on a sustainable development and achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals with a new model. The current model of the West is failing. And as you can see with this case, the systems are failing as well.
Well, so we're going to have to leave it at that. As always, Jazakallah for your time. And I know with the BRICS Summit coming up in August, obviously, you and I will be chatting a lot more. But for now, we thank you. Have yourself a wonderful Jummah, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa Walaikum salam. Shukran to you and listeners. Amin.
Ashraf Patel with us, just unpacking what had happened with Ocean Gate and the Titanic submersible while the world is entirely focused. But there's a lot of food for thought in what Ashraf has actually brought in this discussion this morning. We're going to go for a break. We still have got one more Hajj Diaries. We've got Councillor Imran Musa, who is in Hajj, and he will be joining us after this.